I'm Stephen Mott. I'm president of the James Luther Adams Foundation. And the term foundation is kind of misleading because we don't have an endowment. We supply what we need from contributions of members. When Adams was retired, the foundation helped him to continue writing by providing secretarial support and helping him produce his autobiography and develop his home movies into tapes. After he died in 1994, we concentrated our work, and particularly in two areas. One is to continue to preserve his tapes and papers. The other is the annual James Luther Adams Forum and Religion Society, of which this is the 11th one of those. And we've moved those around the country, various places. This is the second time we've had it at Harvard Divinity School, which is really the most natural, appropriate place for these lectures to take place. We have brochures about the foundation up here on the table if you'd like to pick one up after the meeting. Professor Cox's lecture is going to be followed with a question and answer period, and following that there'll be a reception in the Brown Room, which you're all invited to. It's very easy to introduce Harvey Cox because he's so well known to all of you. I might just start off with a personal note. Harvey came to teach here at Harvard Divinity School in 1965, the same year I began my doctoral work here. James Luther Adams retired in 1968, which means I think I might be one of the few people who did doctoral work under both Harvey Cox and James Luther Adams, which is something that I treasure. One of the things that I admire the most about Harvey Cox is his ability to perceive what are coming developments in theology and sociology, and then to critically evaluate them theologically and sociologically. And it's not trending. It's not trendy. It's the opposite. It's the ability he has to see ahead of time what is significant in development, and often his own critical treatment of those developing issues leads to them being much more widespread in the attention given to them. I think maybe that is something of the gift of the spirit of prophecy, of being able to discern the future while at the same time retaining the core component of prophecy, of critically declaring the will of God for social justice. So it's with that background we wait with eager expectation for what he's going to do with his topic for tonight. James Luther Adams, Evangelical Unitarian or Unitarian Evangelical. So, Harvey?
Well, thank you, Steve, very much. It's the first time I've ever been introduced as somebody with the gift of prophecy. And I hope that was being recorded, because I'd like to play that over many times. I'm really delighted to be here, and especially this kind of an occasion. I do belong to the now diminishing cadre of people who actually had the privilege of studying with Jim Adams personally, and I treasure that as one of the most valuable and wonderful parts of my background. And it was great to get this invitation and then to think again about just how much his thinking has informed my thinking over many, many years. Now, according to Steve Mott, whom you just met, president of the JLA Foundation, Jim Adams once wrote the following sentence, and it's a sentence which could well serve perhaps as a text for my lecture today. Quote, this is Adams, "A fairly good test of a religious liberal is his or her capacity to recognize authentic religious and prophetic qualities among evangelicals." Out quotation. Now you can see why Steve Mott really likes that quotation. It's found in the 21st Century Ministry booklet. There are a series of them having to do with different conferences, and this one was one on Jim Adams that I think had several essays in it. It's probably true that Jim Adams could make that kind of statement because of his own evangelical roots, his own evangelical background. But as I've thought about what I learned from him, I have understood better what I've been doing and still understand it in very, very much the terms that I learned from him, which I'll mention in a moment. Another title for this lecture might have been The Adams Thesis Tested. Let me start out with this vignette. During one of my first trips to the Nordeste in Brazil, the Northeast, about 25 years ago, I met a young Brazilian sociologist from São Paulo who was studying the peasant leagues in the Northeast. They were springing up in an extremely poverty-ridden and arid part of the country. The farmers were organizing these leagues to be able to buy seed, fertilizer, equipment, and to sell their crops cooperatively. And this novice sociologist, she happened to be a serious lay Catholic and belonged to a basic community, Catholic-based community. She discovered as she was studying that what she called and what they called the crentes were playing a very large role in these organizations. Now, the term crentes, it means believers in Portuguese, is a term which is applied frequently both to evangelicals and Pentecostals in Latin America, especially in Brazil. It's a Portuguese word. And so I'm going to use it instead of using the rather elaborate phrase Pentecostals and evangelicals, crentes. She found that they constituted only about 10% of the population of that area. So it's a much higher percentage now. But they had done by far the lion's share of the work and provided most of the leadership of the peasant leagues. So as a good, radical young Catholic, she was eager to find out from these crentes how they linked their faith to their passion for justice and organizing the peasant leagues. And she went out and began to interview them, and they were very puzzled by the question. She said at first, just shrugged their shoulders. They didn't see actually much of a connection. And that rather puzzled her as well. But the more she lived among the crentes and the more she followed them around and went to their services and lived with them, she began to discover what the connection was. These crentes, she said, are practiced list makers. They're list makers. They're used to compiling lists of people that they intend to visit, knock on their doors, evangelize them, invite them to church meetings, revivals. If they're not home, go back again, knock on the door again. If the door has been slammed, go back yet again, another time. Keep knocking. Keep that list in hand. They would return time and time again. And if the door was opened to them, they learned to get their message across very quickly, very succinctly, and very persuasively. Now, she said, these are exactly the skills that you need when you're organizing a peasant league. So no wonder the crentes had set the pace. And I almost entitled this lecture, Blessed Are the List Makers. I think Jim would have liked that. Blessed are the list makers. So I open with this vignette for a couple of reasons. It encapsulates two of Jim Adams's key elements in his social theology. First, the essential qualities of a religious faith can be discerned most clearly in the shape that faith gives to the institutions it spawns. And second, the vital importance of voluntary associations to any healthy society. Both of these symbolized in his most famous dictum, Jim Adams' dictum, by their groups you shall know them, quote unquote. By their groups you shall know them. Now I also mention this story because it comes from a region which has fascinated me now for more than 2 or 3 decades, and it affirms, I think, Jim Adams' premise in a part of the world he knew very little about, Latin America. Jim believed that voluntary associations were indeed the lifeblood and the seedbed of any genuine democracy. They mediate between larger structures of economy, government, education, the press. They provide alternative patterns of organization and unofficial networks. And even more importantly, they school people in the indispensable skills needed to make democracy work. Making a good case, accepting compromises, accepting the will of the majority, all of those things without which a civil society is not possible and therefore a democracy. Now, most people know that the growth of evangelical and Pentecostal Protestantism in the developing world, sometimes we used to call it the third world, now some people call it the two-thirds world, the southern world. In the last 30 years, the growth has been nothing short of spectacular. And Pentecostals probably account for about 90% of that growth. So I'm going to call these two movements together from now on simply crentes, and you'll know what I'm talking about. This is the term which is almost always applied to them in Brazil. Crentes now number about 500 million in the whole world. This makes them the largest non-Catholic grouping among the 2 billion Christians in the world. They have shifted the center of gravity of world Christianity away from the old precinct of Europe and North America and into this two-thirds world. So that as of the last 30 years, it is simply no longer empirically correct to refer to Christianity as a Western religion. It is not. The majority of Christians now live in this non-Western world. And in Latin America, that growth has been as fast as it has been anywhere. 2 or 3 of the Latin American countries already have crente majorities. Others are headed in that direction. When I visited the religious census office in Rio de Janeiro about 4 years ago, they told me that in the previous year, only in the Municipalidad of Rio, 249 new crente congregations had been established. In the same year, 1 new Roman Catholic parish and 2 Umbanda temples. This is the kind of spectacular growth we're witnessing. And let me immediately say, it's my belief, and I think I can show this in a moment, that in recent years, crente congregations have been one of the major sources of voluntary associations in Latin America, and especially in Brazil. Now, what about their politics? Despite the worries of many North Americans, the crentes, although they originally remained aloof from politics, they are now participating more and more, and they have not replicated the American religious right. This has not happened. Every survey indicates that. They're going a different direction. Careful analyses of their political behavior indicates their voting patterns tend toward what might be called the center left. In the recent Brazilian presidential elections, for example, a huge majority of the crentes voted for the Workers' Party, for Lula. The political trajectory of the crentes was captured well in an article published about 2 years ago when one observer wrote what he called the izquierdización de los evangélicos. I guess translated into English that would be the leftification of the evangelicals. The leftification. We don't have that word. Too bad we don't. I'd like to see a little more of leftification, but we don't have the word. Historically, Latin America, as most of you know, has not been a continent richly endowed with voluntary association. In general, if you belong to something in Latin America, you were probably born into it. You were born into it. Whether it's a church or a nation, you find yourself in a collectivity. But I want to borrow and perhaps tweak a little bit the famous distinction that William James makes between the once born and the twice born. Here. Most people in Latin America, as far as their belonging to collectivities, are once born. They're born into it. Virtually the only exception to this rule has been labor unions and ecclesial-based communities in the Catholic Church, and most importantly, the crente religious congregations. I'll call these people twice born. They have to choose to be in these organizations. They're not born into them, and besides, they like the phrase twice born very much anyway, born again. They use it in a somewhat different way, as you know. That is, you have to make a conscious choice to join something. You don't simply find yourself there. All this means that the stunning growth of the crentes is a critical factor in the democratization of the whole region, especially since they are beginning now to participate in public life in an active way, hold public office, and seek to formulate a public theology of their own, a kind of a crente liberation theology. Very promising development indeed. But the continued growth of the crentes and therefore of their contribution to democracy are in no way guaranteed. They are often fragile. Excuse me. They're often fragile, vulnerable both to socio-cultural pressures from without and to threats from within. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about what the prospects are, as I see it, for the future of crente congregations and the whole crente movement in Latin America, and therefore what are the prospects for their contribution to genuine democracy on that continent. What does it take to make democracy work? There seems to be emerging a kind of consensus among most scholars of this subject, and they list a couple things. First of all, there need to be contending political parties, different projects, and free elections in order for people to decide among them. Free elections in which the losers turn over power to the winners. But this is only a bare minimum of democracy. This is not democracy, really, just a bare minimum. It's the kind of thing that the Carter Center focuses very heavily on, but it's only one component. Secondly, democracy requires what Thomas Jefferson called, quote, an informed and active populace, which is free to participate in political deliberations and takes the time to do so. This means that a populace that is informed but not active, or active but not informed, will not suffice, to say nothing of a populace that is neither active nor informed. Go figure. Third, democracy necessitates a society in which the human and civil rights of its people are legally guaranteed and actively enforced. All right, there are the three of the factors that most scholars of democracy agree are essential. Now, some writers have suggested that a fourth requirement for democracy is a market economy. Excuse me, I'm going to take the cough drop out of my mouth. Some writers have suggested that a fourth requirement, and you've heard this, is it's a market economy. Free elections, free markets, and so on. Others doubt that, and frankly, I doubt it myself. China has a rampaging capitalist economy, for example, but few of the essential elements of democracy I've just mentioned. In parts of Latin America, on the other hand, democracy has been gaining in recent years, often to the dismay of some people in Washington. It's been gaining without reference or direct reference to the economy. Some observers of the recent authoritarian direction in Russia believe that the rapid imposition of a market capitalist economy there actually undermined the chances for real democracy in Russia. Polls show that most Russians, when asked, now associate democracy with profiteering, corruption, and thuggery. In view of these requirements for real democracy, contending political projects, informed and active populace, human rights, what are the crente congregations in Latin America doing to nurture them and thus to influence the shape of the public square? Without a doubt, crentes, whether in North America or South America, have always been very public about their faith. These are not people who hide their light under a bushel. They also do not hide their loudspeakers under bushels. They preach in the streets. They preach in the markets. They knock on your front door. It is almost impossible to stroll through a favela in any of the cities of Brazil without hearing the local crente congregations broadcasting its music on a crackling loudspeaker, its music and its message. But this does not mean that they yet have what we would call a public theology. That is a coherent and theologically informed approach to influencing public policy decisions. Although that is changing, and they are beginning to develop exactly that kind of social theology. Until recently, the crente contribution to democracy has been an indirect one. Their role calls to mind the observation of Alexis de Tocqueville in the early 19th century that it was American religion that provided the indispensably fertile soil for democracy. Without all the myriad congregations and other voluntary associations, he said, in America, there would not be the, quote, habits of the heart, which democracy requires. In the religious congregations he visited, Tocqueville observed people learned to discuss issues, make corporate decisions, compromise where necessary, link moral principles to current issues, and finally, to accept the results that these procedural strategies produced. Having learned these skills in the congregations, he wrote, they could then apply them in the public arena, and they did. In short, the free churches of America, unhindered by state sponsorship or hierarchical control, built the networks of responsibility, trust, and an idea of the common good that made America ideal for democracy. Thus Tocqueville's still very convincing argument. Now, remember that there is a real difference between joining a religious congregation, free church or otherwise, in North America at the time of Tocqueville or indeed today, and becoming a crente in South America. A very important difference. In Latin America, choosing to become a crente often exacted a high price, sometimes evoking the scorn and the rejection of one's neighbors, one's family, and until recently, often legal and semi-legal persecution. For Latin America, the crente makes this initial choice. When he or she makes that choice, it requires real courage. More 50 years ago than now, but still real courage. A risky move, unlike the North American congregations that Tocqueville studied. But this choice inhabits what I might call the habit of choosing. The habit of choosing, of knowing you have a choice and can act on that choice. And hence of not feeling that you are trapped forever in your own station. It is a blow against fatalism. Becoming a crente also endows very ordinary people with a sense of dignity. They are important to God, they believe, and to their fellow human beings. They are the bearers of a vital and life-giving message. And to borrow a phrase from North American black culture, they can say, I am somebody. A phrase that Jesse Jackson likes to use a lot. I am somebody. When they've been told in numerous ways, time after time, week after week, you are nobody. Because many of the people joining these crente congregations come from those groups considered to be nobodies by a lot of other people. Once instilled, this sense of dignity, this sense of importance, cannot easily be eradicated. Now, here a cautionary note is necessary. It's important to remember that the main purpose of crentes, until quite recently, the main purpose, unlike, say, the Catholic faith-based communities, the main purpose has not been to influence the realm of public policy. That's not what they were about. They believed and do believe that they've been called to love and to praise God, to receive the priceless gifts of the Spirit, especially if they're Pentecostals, to carry the precious message to the farthest corners of the world. It is also true that some crente preachers constantly exhort their congregations not to become contaminated with this world, especially since it's soon to pass away with the triumphant return of Jesus. But as their numbers increase, and as they see that their participation in public life can make a difference, and has made a difference, crentes preach less about the imminent return of Jesus. Believe me, I've been in a lot of crente congregations. I've listened to more sermons than I care to remember, and I can see the diminishing emphasis on this, perhaps today or tomorrow, return of Jesus, and now much more emphasis on what it takes to live the Christian life in this world, and even perhaps to make this world a somewhat better place. One clear and present threat to the crentes' capacity to nurture democracy, however, is a tendency among some of them to curtail democracy in their own congregations. Their emphasis on charismatic gifts, for example, can make their leadership feel and act in an authoritarian manner. If God gave me the gift of leadership and put me in this position, who are you to differ with the decisions that I make? I've sometimes thought of this as the return of the caudillo, a favorite phrase in Latin American history, the strong man who comes to the rescue, only this time the caudillo as pastor of the crente congregation. Further, dynastic leadership is widespread in many of these congregations. Fathers hand over their pastorates to their sons, and leadership tends to assume a kind of clientelistic direction. Pastors learn how to make deals with whatever powers that be in exchanging votes for patronage. These congregations continue to multiply rapidly, and they are full of rich promise for a democratic future. But crente congregations could petrify, they could shrivel because of their own internal weaknesses. But the crentes also face threats from without. Ruling regimes in any authoritarian country do not worry so much about the ideology or the theology of the evangelical Pentecostal congregations. They don't worry about that much anymore. They worry because these people are, in fact, list makers. They know how to get people together. They get them together regionally, locally, nationally, even internationally. And authoritarian regimes are famously fearful of rival networks of information and organization. An example from elsewhere might illustrate this. The Falun Gong in China are not crentes, but they do form voluntary associations based on their particular kind of spirituality. Still, the communist government was not much concerned about the Falun Gong and their esoteric spirituality until one day, a few years ago, they suddenly overnight assembled 100,000 people in Tiananmen Square. That got the government's attention. Where did these people come from? How were they communicated with? They were there in a non-violent way. It wasn't even a political protest. There they were. That's when the authorities were shocked and fearful and cracked down. In Latin America, during their early growth, these congregations did receive direct threats from without. It came from the Catholic Church in some places, governments that the church influenced. But in my observation, this happens only very rarely on the Latin American continent now, and that's usually in rural areas. And the main growth of these congregations is in large urban concentrations. Perhaps the clearest threat to the future of the crentes in Latin America is a combination of the within and the without. It is the danger of their being drawn into what Harvard historian Charles Meier, in his book Among Empires, calls the American Empire of Consumption. The American Empire of Consumption. Meier recognizes that a fierce debate is going on right now about whether the United States either is an empire or has an empire. But my question here is this one. If the United States has or is an empire, is Latin America a part of it? And what does that mean for the people I'm talking about? Plainly, most Latin Americans think there is an empire and they're part of it. Unmistakable. Yes and yes. Week after week, statements by Latin American groups, religious groups, councils of churches, bishops, conferences, theologians, are replete with attacks on American immigration policy, on the Iraq War, on the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, and on all of the assumptions of what they call neoliberal economics, market economics. But the point is that if Latin America is part of an American empire, then, according to Meier, we can expect to see it managed, indeed controlled, by two methods. First of all, military might, either threatened or used, which happens frequently in Latin America, the use of American direct intervention of military power, or second, by cultural hegemony, which goes on all the time, day and night, 365 days a year. This hegemony, cultural hegemony, is accomplished both through the cultivation of elites, Meier points out. In fact, one of the things he says, we bring them to the Kennedy School to train them. And by the mass distribution of American media and consumer culture. So the question is, are we talking about the growth of a civil society, which is a prerequisite for democracy, or is the word empire perhaps a more useful framework for understanding the context in which Latin American crente congregations now live. If the term empire is most useful, and once again, most Latin Americans believe it is, and I am coming to believe that it is, then the idea of civil society, which was coined originally by Eastern Europeans during the era of communist rule, and then began to be used here, isn't any longer a useful way of understanding the present situation there. I think Meyer doubts it. He documents how all empires, by their very nature, tend to transform grassroots institutions in their own top-down image. These are his words. Empires extend their gradients of privilege and participation outward through space and downward through society. They replicate the hierarchical structures and their divisions at all spatial levels, macro and micro, at the level of community, workplace, as well as the continent. All recapitulate the structure of the whole. Now, this is where the complex inside-outside threat rubs on the crente congregations, something which I've seen over and over and increasing in recent visits. Unlike their forebears in the years before this inundation of their continent with mass media and consumer culture from North America largely, today's crentes swim in this inundation every day. Crentes are not Amish. They do not withdraw into enclaves to live out the faith. They live and they work and they go to school and they shop enmeshed in their societies. But as Professor Robert Putnam has shown in his wonderful book, Bowling Alone, consumer culture, especially television, always weakens voluntary associations, tends to lure people away from active citizenship, and reduces citizens to consumers. And I regret to say that this is also happening in Latin America. And it's happening with the people in the crente congregations. This means also that the political environment of Latin America has begun to replicate the North American consumer marketing approach to politics, which flatly contradicts the highly participatory style the crentes engender and cultivate in their congregations. But the consumerist style, this is perhaps the worst news coming. I'll end with some good news, but here's the little bad news. This consumerist style is not just the wolf at the door. It is also a large camel's nose rather far inside the crente tent. And it finds its expression in what is called the gospel of prosperity. Sometimes called in North America the name it and claim it gospel. You know about this, Steve? Yes. Derived largely from North American sources. This current has begun to influence large numbers of crente churches, but it has found its major bearer in the Igreja Universal del Reino de Dios, the universal church of the kingdom of God, the fastest growing denomination in Latin America, which is now spreading to other continents, by the way, now reaching 40 or 50 other continents. The universal church promises its adherents that if they pray fervently and contribute till it hurts generously, they will receive not only salvation, they will receive health and wealth, not just in this world, not just in the world beyond, but in this world as well. Moreover, the organizational structure of the universal church is very carefully organized on the pattern of North American sales campaigns, with district managers and sub-district managers and all the rest. Its adherents are more like consumers or clients than they are members or citizens. The universal church makes no bones about expecting a price for its blessings and for its exorcisms. It markets itself on television and has recently purchased the second largest TV network in Brazil. So the message is beamed out 24 hours a day. Nearly all the other crente churches have tried to distance themselves from the universal church, and many Pentecostal leaders now refer to it as pseudo-Pentecostal and consider its influence noxious, a virus. But it continues to grow. And alas, like many viruses, some of the other congregations are beginning to pick up on it, either voluntarily or involuntarily. There it is. But this has engendered an ugly dispute among the crente congregations, largely centered on whether or not this theology, this prosperity gospel, is in fact biblical. This dispute points to possibly destructive fractures in the crente community. The Brazilian sociologist Reginaldo Prandi believes that although classical evangelicals in Latin America, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, although their congregations are very small, are continuing to make the kind of contribution to democracy I've talked about here, Pentecostals are not doing as well. Now, he attributes this to the fact of what he calls two nations. He's talking about Brazil in particular. Two nations resulting from the deluge of globalization. The one on top is what he calls the post-ethical, consumption-driven culture found in the swank sections of the cities and the boutique crowd. These are the me-first people who just love the prosperity gospel, who have no interest whatever in what we might call the common good. At the bottom is what Prandi calls the pre-ethical culture. These are people whose daily struggle for survival allows no time for luxuries like pondering the common good or being an active citizen. These groups are poles apart without much in between, and neither generates the stuff needed to build democracy. I think Prandi's observation about the larger society in which all this is going on is a very helpful one. It suggests, at least to me, that in addition to the conditions for democracy I've already mentioned, there is a fourth and a very important one. That is, a democracy needs a populace whose basic creaturely needs are met. People who are scrambling for the next meal for their children or the rudiments of health care just do not have the leisure to participate in the public square as citizens. But I think his observation also implies that an allegedly Christian message, the prosperity gospel, that merely sanctifies the consumerist greed for comfort and commodities is both a betrayal of the gospel itself and a singular disservice to democracy. So, what comes next? Since I have the gift of prophecy, I'll venture out on this limb. Crentes are known everywhere in Latin America for their straightforwardness and their honesty. They're sought out for lower and middle level clerical jobs in bureaucracies because their employers know they will stay sober. They better, or they'll be out of that congregation soon. They arrive for work on time. They do not steal the petty cash. But they still live in societies in which a huge chasm separates the top small peak from the vast, vast bottom. In a sense, crentes find themselves caught between civil society and empire, between the promise of a participatory democracy and the seductive pressure of the empire of consumption. Still, they continue to bring to marginalized and wounded people a sense of dignity, a sense of hope. At the same time, many poor crentes are becoming aware of the political contradictions between their sense of worth within the congregations and the humiliations they face every day in the larger society. So the big question for me is, where will this contradiction lead? I think there are two possibilities. Here I'm closing. Socially marginalized crentes, especially those infatuated by the spurious promises of the prosperity gospel, could become increasingly bitter and increasingly cynical. After you have prayed fervently for a better job, or a stove that works, or a warm house, after you have contributed until it hurts to the church, but no house, no stove, and no job appear, then what? Some people will indeed probably relapse back into the fatalism which has been so lethal in their societies, withdraw into a religious ghetto, give up on citizenship and participation. Or, and this is beginning to happen, they could begin to see that to live in a society in which their humanity is respected will require a commitment to the common good, not just to their own personal salvation, health, and wealth, a commitment to the common good and a vigorous advocacy of real structural change. This is why some observers believe that crentes could become the core of fundamental nonviolent change in Latin America. They might move on from their fascination with the second chapter of Acts of the Apostles, the charismatic gifts of healing in tongues and so on to the 17th chapter of Acts, where it says, these people who have been turning the world upside down have now come here, quote unquote. That was in Ephesus. Is this a real possibility or just a pipe dream? Of course, no one knows. But there are two core beliefs that will play a decisive role. One is conversion, belief in conversion, and the other is what crentes call holiness. Conversion, you must be born again, and holiness, be not conformed to this world. In political terms, conversion means that people can change. And therefore fatalism, personal fatalism, social fatalism, is not permissible. Holiness means that you don't have to buy into the latest mind-numbing fads of the consumer commodity culture and the consumer empire. You can be in but not of this world. Jim Adams' favorite intellectual activity was to chart how institutional patterns that arise first in religious congregations, sometimes small and marginal ones, can ultimately shape and transform a larger society. He loved to think about that, talk about it, write about it. There is no guarantee that this will happen in the ongoing history of Latin American crentes, but it could. Blessed are the list makers, for they shall be called the children of God. Thank you. So we're open now for discussion, and we have to stay in here for a while they set up the refreshments. So if you want to make a fairly long speech, don't disguise it as a question. You don't have to do that. Just make it, and I'll try to respond to it. Anybody? Yes.
I have a question. I'm in MDiv. I'll graduate this semester, and I'm going back to rural Appalachia in the High Mountains to be a pastor. It's a very deeply impoverished group. It's not all that different from the group you've been describing. But what advice would you give me to be a Methodist pastor in a congregation like that?
Forward with hope. Appalachia is certainly very much like the people I've been describing in the area they live in. And I really do think that the sense of dignity, of importance, the fact that you can make a difference, is essential. And many other things are essential. So I would start with that. You'll be serving more than one congregation. If you're a Methodist, they're probably...
I imagine I'll probably have
two or three.
But I have requested the most people in the impoverished area.
So you'll be a kind of circuit rider.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything? What have you thought about this question? How do you?
Oh my God! It's where I'm from. It's where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be able to speak my own language and my family.
Do you sense that there's a kind of fatalism among many people in that region?
They're not even up to that level.
Not up to the level.
I mean, it just. Well, the problem where I come from is, when they settled that area, they emptied out prisons, especially the debtors' prisons in England. The people that settled there didn't know how to read, and they just don't care about books, barley. And one of the big industries is, the Cherokee Indian reservations there. Now that they're into gambling, the people around there make crafts that look like Indian crafts, arrowheads.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the plants growing marijuana in the park. And, education, reading, thinking is just not there.
Mm-hmm. Well, your work is cut out for you there.
Yeah.
I can't give you much more advice than that, except that there are people in other parts of the world whose circumstances are not all that different, who are working at it. And remember, as a Methodist, you are going on to perfection.
Out of the school.
Yeah.
I was brought up crente in Brazil, and now I'm born again UU. But one thing I've noticed is very different from when I was growing up in Brazil in the 60s among crentes. I was not Pentecostal.
AG is Assembly of God, by the way. Go ahead. Excuse me.
Is that now there's this emerging female leadership, women,
Yeah.
from televangelists to pastors of congregations and leaders of faith community. I'm struck by that.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, the second chapter of Acts of the Apostles clearly says, "Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy." That's a pretty basic text. There was a conference about 5 years ago of Pentecostal women preachers. I think it was held in Caracas. Several hundred of them were there from all over the continent. And they had to, as biblically conservative people who respect the authority of the Scripture, they had to deal with all these admonitions that women should be quiet in your churches and all this and that. And they talked about it very honestly with each other. And they issued a report, which I read when it first came out. And interestingly, they didn't question the fact that Paul had said that. And they didn't try to interpret it as we might hear, say from a biblical critical point of view. Maybe that was inserted by somebody, or maybe he was trying to do this and that. I thought it was very interesting. Their answer to it was, look, God must want us to be preachers because, look, here we are. There are 500 of us here. Surely God wants us to be here and to do this. So I'm afraid St. Paul was talking about something else. The evidence, the present evidence of the power of the Spirit and of their calling, which they were so convinced of, and they're supporting each other, I think, has had something to do with it, trumped everything else in their hermeneutical approach to that text. Now, I think that the leadership of women in these churches is one of the most encouraging features. Unfortunately, I think in the Assemblies of God it isn't as developed as I wish it were in Latin America, but it's moving. There are more and more women leaders, and a lot of the women leaders, of course, in the Catholic Church have appeared in the as leaders of the basic communities, the basic ecclesial communities, where they've done fabulous job. And they're not all nuns or religiously trained. A lot of them are lay people. I think the whole picture there is quite encouraging. Last summer I was in Brazil at a conference which was kind of designed to hand on the torch of liberation theology from us old guys who had been involved in it early to a younger generation of people who were coming along. There were 500 people at this conference, and it included Roman Catholics and Protestants and Pentecostals, men and women leaders. They were all there drinking at the stream of liberation theology, so to speak. And the encouraging thing about the Catholics was they were almost all lay people. There were some clergy there, but with lay people, you see, the long reach of the sacred congregation of the doctrine of the faith can't quite do much about them. So the torch of liberation theology has really been handed on to the laity, educated lay people, and they are far more open to participation with Pentecostals, crentes, Protestants than their clerical leadership had been. And the crentes they used to be very suspicious. You must remember this growing up as a Brazilian Assembly of God. That was cooperating with Catholics was not something high on your agenda. But they do that a lot more now, this younger generation. I thought it was a very, very encouraging gathering. Others? Yeah, way in the back.
I wonder, is it the job of voluntary associations that you've been describing, perhaps voluntary associations writ large, and specifically churches, liberal churches, to nurture certain virtues, democratic virtues that are important for the sustaining of a democratic culture and tradition? And some of the virtues that you described, for instance, like commitment to the common good, or hope for the future, anti-fatalism. It seems, as I've been listening to your lecture, that's another way of describing what's going on. Both what James Luther Adams was trying to describe and also what's going on in the crente churches that you've been describing, and perhaps what you aspire to see more of in the future. And is that a way that voluntary associations can change society? By nurturing these kind of democratic virtues?
I think it makes an enormously important, indeed indispensable contribution. Other factors are needed for real change to take place, but still, I think the answer is basically yes. But we are contending more and more now with this top-down empire of consumption, and they certainly are there, and we are everywhere, and that it does dilute participation in the public square. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Professor Putnam, Robert Putnam, has documented this in his book. That's what he did was he was concerned about the decline in voluntary associations in America. He'd also studied them in Italy, by the way, and he was concerned about America, and he did a lot of interviewing people with several theses. Maybe people are working too hard now to participate in voluntary associations. Well, no. The people who are working at two jobs are still the ones who are participating more fully in PTA or their local party politics or whatever they're doing. No. What was it? And the more he studied it, the more he found one single factor, which was a predictor of diminishing participation in public life. How many hours you watch television. That's what was doing it. The more hours people watched television, the less they were active, even in Boy Scouts or Rotary or not particularly politically committed associations, but still associations. And, one of the sad things about walking around a favela, that's the term for a slum, basically, in Brazil, you not only hear the crente congregations singing and giving their message, as you look at these cardboard and dilapidated shacks, there's a television antenna. Even when they don't have running water, they'll often have a television antenna. And they're tuned in mainly to North American television programming. That's what's on. Usually last year's version of they're being recycled there. So that's a little discouraging when you think about that and about now I don't know, it's going to take some thinking, isn't it, to try to put into the picture here the eventual impact of the computer and of the internet, of possibilities of communication, but that's a long way off for many, many poor people in Latin America. They're not going to have their personal computer for a while. So we have these, I guess the thesis of my talk is they're kind of caught between the logic of the consumer empire and the thrust of civil society and participation, which is engendered and nurtured by the congregations, religious congregations. Back there? You, yeah.
Is there a meaningful collaboration between religious critics of the empire in the U.S. and these groups?
Mm-hmm.
To the extent there's not, is that a theological problem, a logistical problem, or just willpower?
There is some, but not very much. See, these groups are very, very active in something like the Foro Social, the social forum, which is the alternative organization to Davos. That's the Latin American congregations, and some of the Catholic groups as well are very active in that. And there are some North American groups there, but I wish there were a lot more attention and participation and cooperation between North American critics and Latin American critics. But we're so preoccupied with another part of the world now, except that I think that, the president is down there now to explain how compassionate and humanitarian America is to the listening audiences of Latin America. I don't know how much that's going to do, but Latin America has not been really very important to the agenda, to most political agendas here. We're understandably very concerned about other parts of the world and not as much about Latin America. So, but they're getting our attention. Yeah.
The congregations, these newly formed congregations, the participants must come from some other religious situation background, presumably the Roman Catholic Church. What has been the reaction of the Roman Catholic Church to the evangelistic spirit of these congregations?
Vic, that's a question that I've interested myself in and watching it over the last really 15, 20 years. In a word, their first response has been panic. It's sometimes described in Catholic literature as a hemorrhage, with thousands and thousands of people per day joining crente congregations, largely from what might be called folk Catholicism or popular Catholicism. Often when we study these folks who do this, they don't have that strong attachment to a local parish that many Latin American Catholics don't anyway. In fact, they don't have access to it frequently. There's such a shortage of parish priests. So the first reaction was, what's going on here? And warnings. Pope John Paul II, in one of his first visits to Latin America, warned about the invasion of the sects, and even unfelicitously used the words wolves in sheep's clothing that you should watch out for, who are stealing lambs from the flock and this and that. Then I saw a slight change, and some of the bishops said, well, look, these people must be doing something right. Maybe we can learn something from them. And so they were a little friendlier. And the other thing they have going for them is something called the charismatic renewal movement within the Catholic Church. So what they've tried to do in a way is to bottle some of the enthusiasm and some of the tropes and movements and worship styles of the crentes within the Catholic community, including speaking in tongues and healing and things like that. And to keep a rather careful eye on it, but still to see where it goes. And this movement within the Catholic Church is growing rapidly. But still, it is a steep decline, very steep decline for the overall population, and therefore for the culture and political influence of the Catholic Church in many places in Latin America. It's really eroding quickly. Really, eroding is too slow a word. It's more than that. But I think it's a little too early to crow about that, because some of these things that could happen within the crente congregation. I mean, like, if this whole business of the prosperity gospel really grips them and takes over, I mean, that's not good news. And the fact is that within the Catholic Church, at least from my point of view, these progressive movements, one of which I just described with this, and with the drawing from the base communities movement, is to be welcome. So it's a confusing picture, but I can tell you that the hierarchy is really not happy with this situation. Yeah.
In the last couple of years, author Chris Hedges has brought James Luther Adams back into the pages of Harper's and The Nation, and most recently with his book, American Fascism. And he talks about Adams specifically at the end of the book, and something that he said when Hedges was a student at this year, basically predicting that by the time Hedges was his age, he would see the rise of a neo-fascist movement in the United States. And in the book, he largely, attributes that to conservative evangelicals in the United States. And I wondered if you could comment on the way Adams himself viewed evangelicalism, and if you could put Hedges' remembrance of that view of Adams into some larger context.
Yeah, without trying to be cute, I would like to hedge on Hedges a little bit. I know him quite well. He was my student here. I think it's an overstatement, and considerably more panicky than the situation requires. I don't think he's generally right in what he's saying. Now, certainly there are authoritarian tendencies within, not just within the evangelical churches, but you have to, if you look at the Roman Catholic religious right, the people who edit First Things and people, the kind of leadership of Michael Novak and John Richard Newhouse, George Weigel, that's got uncomfortably quasi-fascistic qualities in my mind. I don't ever like to call anybody a fascist because it's a pretty heavy term. Nonetheless, it indicates a very far right orientation, and they're talking now about the Catholic far religious right. Their agenda now is really based on the idea that we're in a civilizational war to the death between the Christian West and the Islamic threat. And it's going to be a very, very long, drawn-out struggle. In fact, Richard Newhouse wrote just a while back that when the Muslim radicals refer to us here as the Christian West. Sometimes they'll say the Crusader Zionist West. And we say, oh, no, we're the West. We're not the Christian West. Newhouse says they know better than we do who we are. We are the Christian West, he says, and we are under threat. And this is a terrible threat that we have to meet with military means, all the military means at our disposal. It is a kind of a new crusade. They're willing to use that kind of language. So I think I feel a little uncomfortable picking out the evangelicals as the only bad guys here on the scene. I think there are right-wing evangelicals, surely there are, with some of these tendencies as well. I think they're a little more marginal than Chris Hedges thinks they are within the evangelical movement. And one of the most welcoming aspects of what's happening in American evangelicalism is this broadening out and multiplying of the kinds of social issues that they're concerned with, like the environment and like torture and like poverty and not just their narrow so-called family issues, which is what they've been pushing so hard. I think one is to read that book with a certain grain of salt, if I can put it that way, although there are a lot of very important and interesting things in it. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement. Yeah.
As you talk about that, I think one of Jim's things he'd be sad about is that mainline liberals have not called into question the idolatry
Right.
and the failure of the religious right, whoever they are, to be biblical and to really preach what they proclaim they're about. I think he'd be very hard on liberals for not calling that into question.
Yeah, I think he would. Undoubtedly. And I think he would, I would say the same thing about many evangelicals, that they are not really blowing the whistle on of something which is obviously, to me, idolatry. And they should be doing that. And also with American Catholics, right-wing Catholics. Very peculiar for Catholics who are supposed to represent an international community to have this kind of apotheosizing of America as the bearer of Christian civilization, to the point in which they can disagree with the Pope, who opposed openly and explicitly the invasion of Iraq, and they decided the Pope was wrong. They can be very good Catholics until they disagree with the Pope on something they think is essential. And then they can say, well, he's not sufficiently well informed about that. We'll straighten them out. So I think there's enough blame to be distributed here. My voice is beginning to fade, so I'll take about one more question. Somebody, yeah, you had one too.
A brief comment and a question here. Thank you for the wonderfully informative lecture. Connecting Adams with Adams is really essential thought, I think, with all of Latin America. My experience in this comment with Pentecostal from South America are mostly Bolivians in Washington, D.C., of which there are many, and they have their own congregations. These congregations are connected back with Bolivian congregations in Bolivia. Therefore, they're part of the same community. They are they're pretty conservative politically. They don't like, what's the name of the new Bolivian president?
Morales, yeah.
They see him as a Marxist. And they've been warned, I'm sure, in church about this. Now, this is just one, this is a narrow example. But they also, the power of their communities, though, is, and we have got to know many through as caregivers of my mother-in-law during the last years. They're intensely, caring communities for each other. And here they are, and some of them, not documented people, and some of them are, and making their way, and they have an extremely intense community of mutual support and love. So, well as faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they do bring their faith. They wanted to bring their faith to my mother-in-law in her last hours, and they were helpful to her. I mean, they came and ministered to her. So that's a little bit. That's just on the religious side. My question, though, Harvey, was so we didn't entirely answer the question, did you? Was James Luther Adams an evangelical? I don't think we quite got the answer to that.
Look, Steve Mott worked so far in advance that months ago he asked me, "What's your topic going to be?" So I came up with this one. It's a kind of a teaser. We're both Steve and I are fascinated with how Jim's evangelical roots continued to play themselves out in his thinking in various ways throughout his whole career. I think they did, even when he became a Unitarian. Now, whether he was a Unitarian evangelical or evangelical Unitarian, I don't know. But that was what I started out with. And then I thought, well, maybe the best way to go about this is to examine Jim's social theology. And through the prism, you might say, use that as the prism to examine something that I'm very interested and fascinated with, namely this phenomenon in Latin America. See if it clicks. And it clicks. And he still had these insights, and he was right, I think. And he was right in his warnings, as well as in his more optimistic predictions.
Well, thank you, Harvey. We really appreciate your insights in sharing this. The James Luther Adams Foundation would like to thank Harvard Divinity School for hosting this again. We're very interested in any of you who are younger than some of us, who see yourself as devotees of James Luther Adams, that we can tie into you with our foundation work. I might just say, in just a couple thoughts in terms of the closing, is that I think something behind the question, which is the title of our lecture, is the richness of the Unitarian Universalist tradition. It's very often very different from our stereotypes, and I sort of think that George Williams, who was Unitarian Universalist church historian, he was the advisor to the evangelical students in the yard when I was around here, and so there's again another example of that. I just one thing I'd like to share is that one thing that really reminded me of what you were saying in your lecture is the book called The Transformation of Virginia, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History in the 80s. I can't remember the name of the author. But he starts off talking about the aristocratic culture in Virginia, where the people would wait outside the church until the landowners came and got their seats before they would enter. And then he talks about a different phenomena when the Baptists and the Methodists started moving down the Shenandoah Valley, teaching a quality which is based on the common possession of the Holy Spirit, which had social changes which led to persecution from the more aristocratic culture. And he also says that this is part of the ethos which was behind the support for the American Revolution in Virginia. So that I think there's a lot of similarities between what you're saying there, not only in terms of equality based on the Holy Spirit, but the shaping of the institutions of society around them as a result of that. So that maybe this is something we need to pray for, is that we all have the equality based in our possession of the Holy Spirit. They should be pretty much ready. They said that the brown room probably wouldn't be ready until 6:40, and by the time we gather, I think that'll be fine. If you didn't get a program, there's some by the doors, and feel free to pick up one of the flyers, the brochures talking about the James Luther Adams Foundation.